Hello and welcome to episode 41, series 2 of A Grand Tour with my great-great-granddad. My name is Ed Hill. So if you're tuning in again, I don't know why I use that term, tuning in again, because it's not like a radio, is it, a podcast? It's not as if you're there with a dial, hearing it go in and out of tune as you turn the knob. But anyway, I'm old-fashioned, so I'll use the expression tuning. If you're tuning in again, it's good to have you back, and I hope you're enjoying the podcast so far. As I mentioned in the last episode, and the reason I now describe this as Series 2 is because we're at the part of the journals written by my great-great-grandfather, William Mowbray Campbell Scott, in the 1840s, and we've reached where he's travelling from the UK out to Mexico to work in the mint or coin-making industry there. So it's quite an exciting time after all his travels around Europe that he begins this more geographically extensive journey, I suppose you would say, to the far side of the world and South America. So in the last episode, William had set off from Southampton going via Madeira, which is a route that a lot of ships took in those days when crossing the Atlantic, on this paddle steamer, the Forth. And so that's basically where we finished the last episode, with the steamship anchored off Madeira. I subsequently realised that the reason the ship anchored off rather than actually went into the harbour was that there isn't or wasn't really what you would describe as an actual harbour at that time in Funchal, which is the capital of Madeira. So all the ships anchored there. So when I said, he doesn't actually go into the harbour, no ships did at that time. There is these days a modern day harbour arm that's been built, which a lot of the travelling cruise liners moor against when they visit the island. But at that time there wasn't any actual sort of man-made harbour at Madeira, so all the ships would anchor close by to be resupplied by locals or for people to take a trip onto the island. Although it seems that didn't happen with William. They just literally stopped there to anchor and probably, as I say, get more fresh food supplies. So this next episode, 41, basically continues that journey. So William's leaving Madeira on the paddle steamer and travelling across the Atlantic. This is probably the longest part of the journey that he does before coming across land again. And basically this episode describes his impressions of the first island that he gets to, which is Barbados, and then the next one they visit, which is Grenada. And also at this point William actually transfers from the Forth to a ship called the Clyde, which I might have to do a bit more research into, seeing what that was about. All these ships were part of what was called the Royal Mail Steam Packet Company at that time, so part of their job, as well as taking passengers across the Atlantic to various parts of the West Indies and South America, was also delivering mail to those islands and destinations also. And I think I did mention this in the last episode, there was a lot of people from Europe making their way out to Mexico at this time because of its natural resources, particularly when it came to silver and gold, etc. So William was probably one of many people making their way out to South America, and particularly to Mexico at that time, from the UK and from other countries in Europe. So I'll just also mention how you can contact me directly if you want to on social media. There's a Blue Sky account, which is at scotsgrandtour.bsky.social, and Ed Hill is the name for that account, but it's at scotsgrandtour.bsky.social. There's a Facebook page, which is at Grand Tour with my great-great-granddad. There's a Insta account, which is Ed's 3G Tour. That's EDDS 3G Tour, all lowercase. And there's a Twitter page, Scott of the Historic, and that's at 3G Grand Tour. And a Mastodon account as well. I've basically got a ridiculous amount of social media accounts now, and to be honest, I can't keep up with them all. But the Mastodon one is GG Grand Tour. That's the title page, and I would have thought that would come out if you search for it. In terms of the podcast itself, basically just Google that, and it will come up on all the various podcast platforms that are out there, because it gets distributed from the Acast one to Amazon Music to Apple Podcasts to Spotify, and all in the sundry. So basically you can listen to it on any podcast platform you wish, really. And we've had some new listeners. It's very handy. I can tell where people are listening from, so that's nice to see. So if you're encountering this podcast for the first time, there's a whole load of other episodes before this which deal with William's trip as an engineer on an Italian railway in Milan. So that's really his whole journey around Europe, to go out to Milan, to basically drive a steam train in Milan, and his impressions of that journey. So that was the first 39 episodes, and now we're on to the next stage of his world travels. So this next episode coming up, I think it's really quite interesting. Obviously, William's encountering these places such as the Caribbean for the first time, and in terms of flora and fauna, they're very different, and that makes a big impact on him. And it's great. There's a description of some of his fellow passengers and the crew as well, which is great. So I think there's really quite a lot in this episode that's interesting to listen to and to hear about. So here it is, episode 41 of A Grand Tour with my great-great-granddad, series 2. I hope you enjoy it. Another week has passed over our heads, the weather particularly fine, but we have not seen a single sail since leaving the island of Madeira. Yesterday being Sunday, the captain read prayers as usual on the quarter-deck, and as we have 2 passengers on board who are members of the Society of Friends, the spirit moved them to address the passengers and the ship's crew. Their addresses were the usual rambling nature that distinguished the oratorical displays of that body, and if not generally approved, was at least passed over in silence. Light battling winds today and very warm. At 10:30 p.m, heavy rain. Midnight, a sharp and favourable breeze. And now, having by this time become pretty well acquainted with the passengers and officers of the ship, I may as well endeavour to give some account of both. And first, with the passengers. Foremost on the list stands General Miller, an Englishman by birth, and who has passed the meridian on many occasions. He is of amiable manner and stout in person, and was much distinguished in the wars of South American independence, in which service he received several wounds, and amongst the rest, a musket ball in the left hand, which has nearly deprived him of the use of that member. He is a gentleman of vast information, and equally as ready at parting with it. He is now going out as Commissioner and Consul General to the Sandwich Islands, so that's what we would know as Hawaii today, and is accompanied by his niece, an amiable young lady about 20 years of age. The next passenger I shall mention is Mr. Egerton, part proprietor and managing director of the gold mines at Rio de Elora in Mexico. He had been to England for the purpose of purchasing machinery for the mines, and had during his visit married a young lady of some 25 years, whilst he himself has seen the wrong side of 50. They are accompanied by a male and female servant. Mr. Davis is a gentleman possessed of several estates in the island of Jamaica, and with whom I contracted a particular intimacy during the voyage. He was going for the purpose of paying his periodical visit. Mr. Christie, another planter, and upon the same errand. Mr. Wood, a merchant residing in Kingston in Jamaica, a quiet gentleman who had been in England for his son, who had been educated in the old country. A couple of Irish gentlemen, also resident at Kingston, having been to England upon business. These two were inseparable companions and passionately fond of chess, at which they spent most of their time. Another voyager was Mr. Palmer, a native of the island of St. Kitts, particularly fond of reading, and rum with very cold water, returning home from a visit of pleasure to England. There was also Mr. Mackay, who, as his name imparts, is a Scotsman, and accompanied by his wife, a French lady, and 3 children going to the island of Trinidad. Now this Mr. Mackay was a character. There was nothing on board the ship whatever could please him. The cabins was too small, the cookery was not good enough, the breakfast hour 8:30 an hour too late, the wines were sour, the spirits half water, the weather was either too hot or too cold. But the crowning evil was that the motion of the vessel totally prevented him from shaving, and he of all the passengers was obliged to wear his beard until he got on shore. As for my own part, I never felt the slightest difficulty in performing that operation. I also had the pleasure of travelling with Dr. Martinez, a gentleman born in one of the British colonies, but of French parentage, proceeding to the city of Mexico for the purpose of following his profession in that city, and accompanied by his wife, a very amiable lady, and a son of a year old. There was also a lady whose husband was in the army and stationed at Grenada, proceeding to join him, another lady with 3 children on the same errand to join her husband at Jamaica, a young and handsome lady, strong in the faith of a woman's love, proceeding to the island of St. Vincent to be married, where her intended had gone some 3 years before. Mr. Dupré, a native of Haiti, returning from a mission to England. 6 young men going out as clerks to different West Indian islands. Somewhere about 10 Mexicans returning home after having been to Paris and London for their education. 6 or 8 natives of South America returning to the city of Bogota, the capital of Bolivia. It's actually the capital of Colombia. And I think I have somewhere summed up the principal performers of this part of the drama. And now for the officers. Captain Chapman is a mild and gentlemanly man, particularly anxious for the comfort and welfare of his passengers. The first officer, Mr. Drummond, is a strict disciplinarian and a most excellent sailor. The second and third officers, well-educated young men, and civil and obliging in their manners. The surgeon, Mr. Duncan, a clever man, and an inveterate chess player. The purser, dead sick for the first fortnight and stuck fast in his berth. The engineers and the rest of the crew, all sober, well-ordered men. Right, I'm going to stop here to discuss a few things that William has mentioned so far. Firstly, I quite like that description he gave of the religious society of friends getting up on deck with the others to give some rhetoric, that, although not universally welcomed, was listened to in silence. The Society of Friends, I mean, it's basically the early name for the Quakers, so these people who obviously felt the spirit of evangelism in them decided to say a few words on deck for prayers. I always associate Quakerism with being a quiet religion, which it generally is these days, but it did have moments when members were a bit more evangelical, and divisions as well, so perhaps these 2 people on board were from that particular sect or movement or whatever you want to call it. And of course it's really great getting this description of all the different passengers and the types of people that they were. These moments in the journals are great at kind of painting a picture of what it was like to be on board with all these people. Now, of course, most of the time when William mentions someone that he's travelling with specifically or spending time with specifically, the chances of you actually finding much detail about them is pretty rare. And I've tried in the past, and it's very hit and miss. But actually on this occasion, William talks about the most distinguished passenger being this General Miller. Well, as luck would have it, there is actually quite a bit about him available. Now, his name was actually William Miller, General William Miller. And as William says, he was distinguished for his career in South America. I mean, that is a bit of an understatement to say the least, really. In fact, he became known as Guillaume William Miller, and he basically had a very long and distinguished military and political career, but very varied as well. He was actually born in Wingham in Kent, which is not far from where I am now, and he joined the British Army at an early age, fought in the Peninsular War with Wellington, distinguished himself in those campaigns against Napoleon, also fought against the Americans. Sounds like he was quite a bright guy. By the time he joined the army, he already knew many, many languages. But then, after he'd finished his soldiering in Europe and America, He actually resigned from the British Army, but probably because he'd been fighting along with fellow South Americans who'd been involved in the Peninsular War. At this point, there was a general movement of the Southern American countries, states, whatever we want to call it, wanting to gain independence away from the Spanish Empire. So he goes out to Argentina and then Chile, and he joins the various armies there, and I suppose he had a good history of being a commander by this time, and was successful in helping Saint Martin, who was one of the leading South American generals fighting for independence for these nations. He helped him a lot in his campaigns, but his relevance particularly is linked with the independence of Peru. And because he helped with that movement, he was in command of the army, he helped train the army. He even was also involved in naval battles and took command of some of the naval ships and attacks at the time. There's a naval captain called Lord Cochrane who was very famous for his exploits during this time, fighting with the revolutionaries and their navies against the Spanish. So William did much the same. If you look up Lord Cochrane, he's like meant to be the character that Horatio Hornblower is, and Aubrey from the Patrick O'Brian novels and all that. Tremendously successful, dashing naval commander. But in many ways, William Miller was the same, but more from a army background rather than naval background. And these days, he's considered one of the heroes of the founding of Peru. And in fact, he's buried in the Panteón del Los Proqueros. I don't know if I quite said that right, but anyway, it's the Heroes Pantheon in Peru, where these various heroes of the Republic are buried and celebrated. And the funny thing is that when William talks about the timing, he did sort of have seemed sort of almost on-off relationship with South America. Sometimes he was very much involved with it, and then he would return to England, often because of ill health, because he'd suffered so many wounds. As William mentions him about having this musket ball through the hand that had made it virtually unusable. But the timing is exactly right, because he'd returned to England and in the end was appointed as a sort of governor of the Sandwich Islands, or Hawaii. As I said, it was known then, but really it was kind of governor of the Pacific area. So this timing of him being on this journey with William absolutely fits in with that, with this appointment of being made governor of the Sandwich Islands. You know, William really did happen to be on board at the same time with a truly remarkable hero. I mean, he's obviously not that well known in this country, but I'm sure if you mention him in Peru, he would be very well known. In fact, it said when he died, because he was going to return to England just before he died, and apparently I think he was on a British ship and he died on this British ship, and he was buried in a British cemetery out in South America, but his body was then later moved to Peru to this Heroes Pantheon Hall. But actually after he died anyway, they found that there were 2 lead bullets still lodged in his liver from the various campaigns and military actions he'd been involved with. So, he certainly was a very remarkable guy. And I do love this thing that William says at the end. I mean, you can interpret it 2 ways. You can interpret it that he says he's a very knowledgeable man, and he could be enthusiastically saying, and always happy to impart with it. But I think I detected a resigned, yes, he does go on a bit, sort of side of it to William's description of him there. But if he led the life which supposedly he had, no wonder he had a lot to talk about, basically. Maybe William felt a bit inadequate in his presence. I think most people would really. He was quite a tall figure, very dashing in his early young days. So I can imagine maybe the rest of the passengers got a bit tired of him discussing his exploits. I don't know. But the timing definitely suits what happened in his career and his life. He died at the age of 61. Which was, for those days, pretty good going, and considering all the military campaigns and things that he'd been involved in and injuries he'd had, I think it's pretty amazing he made it up to that age as well. So there you are. Unfortunately, I did look into some of the other people who were mentioned by William, but didn't have any joy finding anything about them. But certainly General Miller, or Guillaume Miller, as he's better known, and as he sometimes signed himself, if you look into the research, you'll see there's often things showing his signature saying Guillaume Miller. He was definitely a hero of Peruvian revolution and independence.
siempre, y antes niegue sus luces, el sol. Que faltemos al voto solemne que la patria al eterno elevó. Que faltemos al voto solemne que la patria al eterno elevó.
October 18th. Passed 2 sailing vessels today, the first we had seen from Madeira. The weather beautiful, the wide Atlantic calm as a looking-glass. We have lightning every evening and remarkably vivid also. At 4:30 p.m. we had a shower of rain, such as is only seen in the tropics. It literally fell in torrents. October 19th. Passed 2 more ships today, one American and the other Danish. Weather very fine, the ship running 9 knots an hour. October 20th. Passed a large English vessel at 11 p.m. and 2 more in the afternoon. Ship making 9.5 knots. October 22nd. At 7 a.m. passed an English vessel, and owing to some mismanagement on the part of our own ship, had great difficulty in preventing a serious collision. Vast numbers of flying fish have been playing around the ship this morning and spreading out their silvery wings in all directions. And now a little rhyming couplet from William. On the 1st and 20th day, land, land again they cry. Behold you lovely island, looming twixt the sea and sky. At 11 a.m. the cry of land took all hands forward, and we had the pleasure of seeing the island of Barbados on the starboard bow. The island is low but very densely populated, and we could discern some very good buildings and churches, and also excellent roads in different parts along the coast. We came to anchor off Bridgetown at 3 p.m, alongside one of Her Majesty's frigates, Peak, of 50 guns, and the Wasp, a brig, 18 guns. And again, more poetry here. The captain mounts the paddle box, and silence is the word. Be steady now, brave boys, said he, let not one voice be heard. Your anchor on the cathead swing, the cable whirl give out, then see that all is clear ahead, and find what you're about. The anchor now let go, he said. 'Tis gone, they cried. The gallant vessel gaily swings into the gentle tide. The boatswain pipes all hands below, the captain gaily cried, and with a double share of grog, let each man be supplied. Well, traveller, as I have been here, I am for the first time of my life in a tropical climate. Everything presents a different appearance to what it does in the old country. The luxuriance of the vegetation is the first thing that attracts the attention of a stranger. And then when he comes to examine in detail, he finds everything so different to what he has been accustomed to. Groves of coconut trees, rearing their taper stems in the air to the height of 50 or 60 feet. And on the top a large bunch of leaves, in the midst of which are the nuts, growing in a large bunch to the number of 20 upwards. And strange to say, this tall and graceful stem is not wood after all. It is composed of a stringy fibrous matter bearing a strong resemblance to a dried cabbage stalk. Then there is the graceful plantain, with its long green leaves of 6 or 8 feet in length, and its graceful and nutritious fruit, orange and lemon trees, shaddocks and breadfruit trees, the alligator pear, mangoes, sweet potatoes, and a variety of others that a European sees for the first time. And then the population of all shades, from the pure white of the European to the jet black of the African, and speaking a language which, though intended to be English, is nearly unintelligible to a stranger. These all produced upon the mind a strange and undeniable sensation, which is impossible to describe. We were no sooner at anchor than the ship was surrounded by an immense quantity of boats, but being Sunday, no fruit nor anything else was brought off for sale, as they are in the habit of keeping the Sabbath more strictly than they do even in the old country. Most of the boats had 4 oars and were steered by a female, and I could not help contrasting the difference there was in appearance of the two sexes. The men were dirty and slovenly, the females, on the contrary, were distinguished by a particular neatness in dress, and by extreme cleanliness, most of them being clad in white, and that of the most dazzling purity. Right, going to break in here again to say a few things about what William's been discussing. Obviously, he sees the island of Barbados for the first time. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail about Barbados itself. You can look it up, but I would probably just simply say that it was one of Great Britain's oldest colonies in the West Indies, so it had quite a English or British feel about it, I think, and even by William's time, it had evolved to be quite like that. But the things that I thought I'd talk about was, firstly, I just think it's quite nice that William discusses all the different plants and vegetation that he sees for the first time. You know, it must have been quite an eye-opening thing for him when he describes all the different fruits, like the plantain and the coconut tree and the alligator pear, as he calls it, which, not surprisingly, I think, given the name, is actually what we'd call an avocado. I think later on he actually eats an avocado and goes into a bit more detail about what it's like. But anyway, I was quite struck when talking about this thing about the coconut tree not being a tree or not being wood, because it did pique my interest. I think this is partly because when my wife and I were doing a world trip a few years ago, we stopped off, I think it was in the Cook Islands, and, we were buying souvenirs and things like that. And one of the things we bought was a wooden walking stick for her father, which was made out of coconut wood, and it was carved with a sort of snake-like thing on the handle and coiled around the stem as well. And we also had a sort of bowl thing, I remember, that's made out of coconut wood as well. And of course, in appearance, it does look quite different from normal wood. It's quite open grained. It has a very particular pattern. But I just thought I'd look up and see, is it a wood or is it not, as he says? And actually, it is classified as a hardwood. Interestingly, the outer part of the trunk is where the hardwood is, and the darker coloured wood, it almost has a colour like mahogany. And in fact, people are saying it's quite a good replacement for mahogany if it's planed and machined in the right way and so forth. So William's wrong there, really, because it is officially a wood, even though it grows differently from traditional trees in the sense that you don't have rings every year being created as it expands. It grows in its own particular way that palm trees do. I don't really know botanically what the difference is there, but in terms of the timber that's produced and the wood that's produced by it, it is called a wood, it is a timber. And in fact, it's being used more and more often as a hardwood. People have suddenly realised that it's a good replacement for endangered species like mahogany and lignum vitae and stuff like that. And of course, lots of it's being grown to produce coconut. So these days, you could say coconut is a wood, and William was wrong there. And it does actually look rather nice when it's coloured and finished in a certain way with the grain and stuff like that. It does look quite distinctive, but it can have quite a nice dark reddish brown hue to it. He only mentioned it in passing, really, but it did strike me as interesting. And, of course, it's the first time that he'd seen palm trees certainly growing in their natural environment. I don't know whether he'd seen any growing around Europe that might have been planted there, but he doesn't mention them. The next thing I wanted to mention was he says they lay alongside two naval ships, one of which was called HMS Peak. And it turns out that the one that William's talking about, which was built in 1834, had quite a distinguished career in the Royal Navy. In fact, it was in the Royal Navy or sort of around right up until 1910. But it was originally built and designed in 1834, and it was designed by a naval architect called Sir William Simmons, and it was actually part of a number of ships that were designed by him in the 1830s that were exploring new ways of hull design and hull shape and also propulsion. I suppose still at that time it mainly would have been sail, but I suppose steam was just coming in. Anyway, he designed a number of early ships experimenting with new ways of construction, propulsion, etc. But HMS Peak itself, it's not 50 guns that Will said. It's a frigate that had 36 guns, a fifth-rate frigate. I'm not quite sure I fully understand what the rating is. It's something to do with the number of decks and number of guns. But anyway, I'm not Patrick O'Brien, so I don't know the intimate things in and out about naval ships. But it had this quite interesting career. Not that long after it was built, it ran aground off sort of South America or the West Indies somewhere, and it managed to sail rudderless all the way back to Portsmouth. It doesn't say who the captain was who made this journey back, but he managed to sail it back rudderless all the way back to Portsmouth. And when it got to Portsmouth, they discovered that there was a great big hole in it, in the bottom of its hull, but luckily it was plugged by this huge boulder that had been stuck in the hull. And indeed, this boulder is still around today, and it's in the historic dockyard at Portsmouth, and you can go and see this boulder. I think it's in the Porter's Garden or something. Anyway, so there it is, this great big massive lump of rock that stopped HMS Peak from sinking because it plugged the gap which had been created when it ran aground. Anyway, it was repaired, the ship was repaired, and then it was involved in quite a lot of naval exercises in the West Indies, so it's no doubt that's why William sees it when he does. But in 1840, it was involved in a attack on Egypt, basically. It's a bit complicated, but there was a thing called the Egyptian-Ottoman War, which broke out about, I think it was 1838 to 1840, something like that, roughly about that time. And Austria and Britain were allies, helping the Ottoman Empire, which would be, so I suppose, modern-day Hungary, defeat the Egyptians, basically. Can't really remember now what the dispute was all about. But anyway, HMS Peak was one of the ships that was involved in bombarding a place called Acre, A-C-R-E, in Egypt. And it was actually quite a devastating attack by the Navy because the Egyptian cannon were all mounted on a sort of castle or fortification on the coast. Unfortunately, they didn't allow for the ships coming in much closer, so when they were firing their cannon, they actually went over the ships. Anyway, HMS Peak was one of the ships on the line firing onto the shore, apparently very accurately, because there'd been new advances in gunnery accuracy by the Royal Navy at this time, and hitting these fortifications on the Egyptian coast. And amazingly, in 2012, when they were restoring the coastline and carrying out sort of refurbishment work and stuff like that, they found 3 cannonballs that had been fired by HMS Peak that had lodged themselves into the wall. And there's a picture of one of them there, which I'll post when I finish doing this podcast. I'll post it on the website. And they apparently all grouped quite close together, which demonstrated the accuracy of this gunnery at the time by the crew on HMS Peak. And yes, there's a picture of this cannonball lodged in the wall at Acre. So it wasn't, as Will says, a 50-gun ship. It was a 36-gun ship, but it had quite a lustrous career, and it carried on. You know, when you consider that steam would have been coming in more and more as the years progressed through the latter part of the 19th century, but it didn't sort of finish its service in the Navy until the late sort of 1890s, and then eventually it was sold, I think it says, to Portsmouth Council, and was used as a sort of hospital hulk to house people who were suffering from cholera. I say to house people, I mean, it's probably where they died, isn't it, really? It was that sort of death hulk moored off Portsmouth. So there we are, HMS Peak, that Will saw had quite an illustrious naval career, really. Just last, it's quite interesting that he mentions the ship doing 9.5 knots, which is quite fast if you can consistently maintain that speed at that time. But I suppose compared to a modern passage ship, it would probably be doing about, I think they average about 20 knots, something like that these days. So they'd be going sort of twice as fast. But, you know, it's consistently keeping up 9 knots, 9.5 knots on the passage is pretty good. But there we are. We've learnt some things. We've learnt that coconut wood is a wood. The alligator pear is an avocado, which I rather like the description and name alligator pear compared to avocado, really. And we've learnt that HMS Peak seems to have been quite a lucky ship in the Royal Navy, I think, given her background and given the things that happened to her and her longevity in the Navy. So well done, HMS Peak. 3 cheers for her.
Hip hip hooray!
8 p.m. Most of the passengers have gone to spend the night on shore, but I shall delay my visit until tomorrow morning, as we do not sail from here until the hour of 7 p.m. The climate here at present is beautiful, but I believe rather hot in the summer. The evening has been charming, with a pleasant breeze off the land. October 23rd. Rose pretty early this morning, and on going on deck saw the Teviot Royal Mail steamship bearing towards us, and in the course of half an hour she was at anchor alongside. At the same time Her Majesty's ship Resistance, 74 guns, entered the roads, having 20 regimental fusiliers on board, who had come for the purpose of relieving the garrisons of Barbados and Grenada. At 7 o'clock I landed on the island and wandered for a considerable time about Bridgetown. Visited the cathedral, a large but plain building of stone, the barracks, hospital, fort, etc., and was much pleased with the island. The streets of Bridgetown are wide with flagged paths, but unpaved in the carriageway. The houses are nearly all built of timber and covered with shingle. The windows are unglazed, as the climate is never cold enough to need glass windows. Breakfasted at the principal hotel, in company with most of my fellow passengers. Afterwards visited the market, a most beautiful spot, the building forming a square, and the centre planted with large and shapely trees, which give a refreshing coolness to the place during the hot season. The branches of those trees were filled with birds of the most beautiful plumage, and singing the most melodious tones. Each square of this market is confined to one object, one side for butchers, meat another, for fish another, and another for fruit and vegetables, and the last for drapery goods. The meat market contained beef, mutton, and veal of most excellent quality. The fish market has a large supply of both fresh fish and salted, but of a species entirely new to me. But it was at the vegetable market that the greatest display took place. There was every description of tropical fruits and vegetables, many of which I looked upon for the first time. Indeed, so much time did we spend here that we had very little leisure for anything else. The neighbourhood of Bridgetown abounds in pleasant and shady walks, and on the seashore are excellent baths. The island is considered to be in a very prosperous and thriving state. The greatest comfort appears to prevail amongst all classes, but the longest visit must have an end, and having accordingly stopped to the utmost limits of our time, we hastened on board for dinner at 5:30. The island of Barbados is one of the Caribbean and the most eastern of the West Indian Isles. It is supposed to have been discovered by the Portuguese, but belonging to the English, and was settled by the latter in 1605. The climate is hot, but the air is pure and moderated by the constant trade winds, but it is subject to hurricanes. The soil in the lowlands is black, somewhat reddish in the shallow parts, and on the hills a chalky marl, so that's a kind of sedimentary and sort of rocky soil. And near the sea the soil is generally sandy. Of this variety of soil, a black mould is the best suited to the cultivation of the cane, and with the aid of manure has given greater returns of sugar in favourable seasons than any in the West Indies, the best lands of St. Christopher excepted. The houses of the planters are very numerous, all along the country, which with the luxuriant productions of the soil and the gently swelling hills form a delightful scene. Barbados is 21 miles long and 14 broad, containing 106,470 acres, most of which is under cultivation. It is divided into 11 parishes and contains 4 towns, viz. Bridgetown, the capital, Speightstown, Austin, which is now Oistin, and Jamestown. It lies 20 leagues east of St. Vincent, 20 leagues southeast of Martinique. Longitude 59 west, latitude 13 degrees 10 north. Population 150,000. Precisely at 7 p.m. the notice to start was given, and the Forth and the Teviot glided away at the same moment, and holding on their course together side by side for several miles, so near that we could converse with each other from different ships. At 9 p.m. the Teviot put up her helm, gave us 3 cheers, which we returned, and held on her course to Martinique, the Forth at the same time bringing her helm to starboard in her course to Grenada. October 24th. On awakening this morning and opening my cabin window, I found that we was running alongside the island of Grenada. A striking difference is presented in this island from that of Barbados. Grenada is lofty and precipitous, and bears evident marks of volcanic origin. At 9 a.m. we made fast alongside the Clyde. to which vessel the great majority of passengers were to be transferred, myself amongst the number, and also 960 bottles of quicksilver for the mines of Mexico. Mercury as we would know it. After the bustle of shifting luggage and taking possession of new quarters was over, I had an opportunity of looking around me. We were laying in the centre of a fine landlocked bay or harbour, the best in the West Indies, approachable by a narrow passage only, and strongly fortified. In front lay the town of St. George, rising in the form of an amphitheatre from the water's edge to the top of the mountains. The houses are well built, chiefly of brick after the British manner, and covered with tile and blue slate. There are also some very elegant stone mansions, and here glass windows seem to be universal. There are 2 excellent built churches, and very fine barracks, and military hospitals, etc. On the left above the town is an ancient fort built by the French when in possession of the island. The houses are all built on terraces fronting the harbour and interspersed with gardens and groves of coconut trees, fuchsias, camellias, and all the various varieties of the cactus tribe. If I had been surprised at the beauty and luxuriance of the vegetable world at the island of Barbados, I was much more surprised at Grenada. The vast variety, the splendour of the flowers and foliage almost compel you to think that you are treading on enchanted ground. The valleys teeming with all the vegetable productions of the tropics. The mountains covered with immense forests of mahogany, cedar, lignum vitae, and other valuable woods. Add to this also that this island is particularly healthy, neither subject to hurricanes nor earthquakes, render it altogether the most delightful spot. It is considered, in fact, as the superior in healthiness and fertility of all the West Indian islands. This island is also one of the Caribbees, and was discovered by Columbus in 1498. But the Spaniard at the time, being intent on settling on the continent of America, neglected this island, so that the natives were allowed to remain in quiet possession of it till the year 1650, when the French governor Martinico Porquet sent about 200 adventurers for the purpose of taking possession of it. They affected to purchase the lands which they occupied from the inhabitants, but a quarrel soon broke out. The new settlers proceeded to attack the natives and to massacre them wherever they could be found. Under these enormities, the whole race of Caribs who possessed Grenada in 1650 were speedily exterminated. But no sooner had the French obtained undisputed possession of the island than they began to quarrel amongst themselves. These contests, however, ended in the establishment of the authority of Duporquet under his lieutenant. But the expense of attending the plantation from its outset, and the maintenance of the force necessary to overawe the turbulent, had so greatly impaired the fortune of Duporquet that in 1656 he sold the island to the Count de Cerillac for 30,000 crowns. This new proprietor appointed a governor so rapacious and oppressive that he was at length deposed and put to death by the colonists, and no greater profit occurring in the meantime, the proprietor from its possession, distracted as it was by internal commotions, he conveyed his rights and interest in Grenada to the French West India Company. Its charter being abolished in 1674, the island from this period fell under the administration of the Crown. So little progress had cultivation made under all the calamities to which it had been exposed, that in the year 1700 the island contained less than 1,000 inhabitants. After the Peace of Utrecht, the condition of its inhabitants began to improve, though it changed master repeatedly until 1783, since which period it has remained in the possession of Great Britain. Population of Grenada, 34,732. Right, I'm going to stop here to say a few more things about this part of the Caribbean that William was travelling through on his journey. So, just to say, Barbados and Grenada, geographically, they're part of what's known as the Lesser Antilles. So if you look at the Caribbean islands, you've got the Greater Antilles, which are the larger islands to the north. So that's Cuba, Hispaniola, I think Puerto Rico, those 3 main big islands. And then you get the Lesser Antilles, which are south of those, and they form a sort of arc downwards towards the equator. And actually, Barbados is one of the, I think, more eastern one of the islands. I think it's the most eastern of the Lesser Antilles. And Grenada is pretty well the southernmost island of that arc. So it's interesting the route William takes, obviously from Madeira. They go to Barbados, then down a bit, and then up a bit, because I know later on he does go to Hispaniola. So I suppose this was part of also these ships' duty to visit places where they were delivering mail to, I suppose, which might account for the route that they took. I mean, William's account of the history of these islands is quite accurate, really, so I won't go too much into the detail that he says about that. But these islands were, before the Europeans came, Columbus and then subsequently the British and the French and the Dutch, they were inhabited by a group of tribes called the Caribs. And actually they were initially quite successful in repelling the European invaders. They were quite fierce and they had quite a reputation for being fierce. And Grenada is a good example of that because the Carib tribes there quite successfully repelled the Europeans. In fact, there was a British settlement that tried to settle there in 1609 and were basically massacred by the locals. But of course what happened was, as I suppose the financial and trading benefits of the Caribbean islands became more apparent to the Europeans, then they then put more resources into conquering them and expelling the indigenous people. So as William alludes to in his description about Grenada, how basically they were wiped out by the French in Grenada, regrettably. Also, particularly with the French and British and people like that, they saw this part of the Spanish Empire as a relatively weak area where they could fight the Spanish and take them as part of their own empire, which was another sort of trend that happened. So just to mention about Grenada, when William gets there, he's in this harbour, St George as it's now known. It's the capital of Grenada, and it does form this very ideal natural harbour. It's a real arc, so it's good for ships who are making their journey around this part of the Caribbean. Basically, as William sort of says, Grenada was initially French, and through various treaties, some battles as well, it ended up being British in the end. Just one thing I thought I'd mention here is when William transfers from the fourth ship to the Clyde, he mentions that they also take 960 bottles of quicksilver, or mercury as we know it, and he says for the mines in Mexico. So just to briefly explain, I will go into this in more detail probably later on, but mercury was used in gold and silver mining, because when you get the raw ore of these metals, particularly silver, and you mix it with mercury, basically it forms what they call an amalgam, and the solid silver is extracted from the ore by using mercury. And what was the process called? Hang on. Yeah, weirdly, this process was called the patio process. So they had these large vats of a mixture of mercury and the ore, and I think there were some other chemicals involved as well that were heated, and this process basically extracts, eventually through several methods, you end up being able to extract the solid silver and gold as well to some extent. They used it with fine gold powder to help extract the powder, but as we know, mercury is extremely toxic, particularly, funnily enough, not so much through contact on the skin, which I always thought was the worst element that you could have with it, but it's actually more by inhaling it. And of course, a lot of the processes they used involved heat and evaporation of mercury, so it was pretty dangerous to work with. And as you can imagine, health and safety things were not very high on the agenda at that time. So yeah, it's pretty awful stuff to use. I think another name for mercury is, I don't know if this is Greek, hydrogyrum. Anyway, it's that silver water is another term for it. But yeah, that's basically why they're transporting so many bottles of mercury on this ship at the time to be used in the mining industry. I don't know what the weight of mercury would be, but 960 bottles is a lot, isn't it? I know, of course, it doesn't say how big the bottles, whether that was a pint or a litre or a gallon. Anyway, sorry, getting back to Grenada, it's mainly through various incarnations remained as a British colony down the years. You might remember in 1983 it was actually invaded by the Americans, because at the time it had had a series of coups and things, but it was becoming more left-leaning in its politics, and the Americans were worried about its sort of association with Cuba, and there was a big runway being built there at the time by developers that they thought would be a way of Cuba getting involved and supplying South America. So basically the Americans didn't really like what was happening politically in Grenada, so invaded it in 1983 when Ronald Reagan was president. They hadn't told the British that they were going to do this, but I suppose the Falklands War just happened where the Americans had helped us rather a lot in terms of military intelligence. So perhaps they felt we owed them one when it came to them invading the Caribbean. I do vaguely remember it happening, and this kind of thing in this country, like, they can't just do that without telling us. But anyway, they did. But since then, democratic elections were held, and actually it's been politically quite a stable country since then, although it has suffered things like terrible hurricanes and things. But one interesting thing I noted when reading about Grenada is that it's actually the biggest producer of nutmeg in the world. It does grow other spices as well. I think mace is another one, but nutmeg in particular is its primary export. In fact, it produces 40% of the world's nutmeg. So it's a very important agricultural product that they export around the world. And apparently it was first introduced in 1843, so around the time when William was doing his journey there, and apparently some ships had nutmeg trees and they planted a few in Grenada to see what would happen, and they did spectacularly well. And so then from then on, nutmeg became a very important crop. Obviously, like a lot of the Caribbean, tourism is quite important as a part of its economy, but if you want to get your nutmeg, then Grenada is the place to go. Okay, that's the end of episode 41 of A Grand Tour with my great-great-granddad. I thought it was a really interesting part of the journals when he's encountering these islands and cultures for the first time. I think it would be fair to say there are moments in those extracts when William's language is a little unpolitically correct to our modern ears. But obviously he is writing in his time with some of the attitudes of his time. I would say that generally, actually, there is very little bigotry in the journals in general. And in fact, most of William's bigotry, if you want to use that term, is usually also very connected with the Catholic Church. So there's a sort of element of both race and Catholicism combined, which he sometimes targets his displeasure at. But really, given the situation, there isn't a huge amount of, for want of a better word, racism, but there are moments, certainly later on in the journals, where I think you could really only say there are moments like that, but they're not expressed in, I think we would say, familiar, bigoted terms. But they do convey rather strange and outdated attitudes. Having said that, this particular episode, as I said at the beginning, is really nice in terms of his describing the journey. I mean, I think for me, I'm particularly interested in seagoing and sea journeys and sailing and so forth, so it does appeal to me particularly. So this element of the journey where he's travelling on this steamship I find particularly fascinating, but it's also great hearing about things like the characters of the different passengers, like the forever complaining Mr. Mackay, no matter what happened on the vessel, was not happy. So yeah, it's great to hear those sort of descriptions. Oh, it's too hot, it's too cold, I can't shave. This whiskey's wear her down. You hot love, I'm absolutely sweating pearls here on the ship. It doesn't make me chuckle, the thought of Mr. Mackay. So for reasons like that, I've found this episode particularly interesting. I don't know how fascinated you were by the world of coconut timber. I don't know, but anyway, it was something that, for some reason, seemed to catch my imagination at the time. As I say, it's a whole smorgasbord, this podcast, of stuff that William happens to mention, and then I, for some reason, will get interested in and look into. Because actually William does read a lot of history, I think, and use those notes in the journals quite a lot. So sometimes it's actually nice to get away from those specific historical descriptions and explanations so much and focus on some of the other things he's talking about. So I'll just very briefly say there's all those social media ways that I mentioned that you can contact me if you want to. The Blue Sky account, Scott's Grand Tour, the Facebook page, which is at Grand Tour with my great-great-granddad, Twitter, Scott of the Historic, etc., etc. So I won't go through them all, but they're all ways that you can contact me if you wish. And by all means, if you want to illuminate something that I've either got wrong or you know more about than me, I totally admit that this is not an in-depth study in history of these things. I'm really just trying to explain the journals and some of the stuff William mentions that can seem quite obscure to us as modern listeners. So that's it really. Once again, if you're a regular listener, thank you so much for listening. And if you're new, do tell your friends, do subscribe. I don't often say that, but I should say it a lot. Do subscribe so you can hear the episodes when they come out. Apologies that there's been a bit of a gap actually between this one and the last one. Down to not serious ill health, but in an attempt to get fit again and play tennis, I've hurt my shoulder rather badly and incapacitated me for quite some time. So that's to some extent why there's been a bit of a longer gap than usual between episodes. So apologies for that, and hopefully the next time it won't be so long. Anyway, that is the end of episode 41, series 2 of A Grand Tour with my great-great-granddad. If you have been, thanks for listening.